Hallo und guten Abend. Hello, good evening, and a big welcome to everyone who's listening in Hanover and elsewhere. My name is Bernd Schmutz. I'm currently guest professor in Hanover at the Faculty of Architecture and Landscape. And I'm very happy that tonight, as a second part of our studio lecture series, we have Adam Kahn with us from London. Hello, Adam. Before we start, maybe some brief information on the work of your office. Adam Kahn started the office in 2006, almost 15 years ago, and he's now running it with his partner Juliette Scalbert. There's a staff and a team of around 20 people based in Hackney in East London. And to date, you have completed a broad range of very different schemes, and I'm really intrigued by the diversity and by the particular approach that you take for each found situation. And the context is often very diverse, from city to landscape, but also internationally. You work with your projects in the UK, in Denmark, in Germany, also in Belgium, just to name a few. And you are also working on a large range of programs. You're doing buildings for art and artists, like the Seizure Gallery and the Yorkshire Sculpture Garden. You're working for communities, you're working with communities, and lately you are building large, smaller, but also increasingly larger housing schemes for various communities and people. Many of these schemes have received awards. The Mies van der Rohe Award nomination, the Civic Trust Award, but also RBA awards. There's a long list, and it shows that your work is nationally and internationally recognized. And I think base for that is probably also that you enjoy participating in discourse and debate, and that's not only in the office, but it's also with teaching at universities. And that has been, for example, at the CAS University, London Metropolitan University, the Royal College of Art, Kingston University, but also abroad at TU Munich and in Porto. So it's really great that you're here in Hanover tonight with us. We're very happy, and I guess we're now very curious how the title of Le Cru et le Cuit vom Rohen und Gekochten resonates in your work. At this point, and I hand over to you, Adam. Welcome, and thanks in advance.
Great, thank you, Bernd, for that very kind introduction. Can I just check that you can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so yes, the lecture is not in French. You'll be lucky because my French isn't quite that good. But the raw and the cooked, I mean, I'm going to focus tonight on the work that we're doing that has some kind of connection to the rural, to the country side. I mean, that's partly really to suite with your teaching program that Bernd is running, but it's also a very strong interest for us. And so it's nice to bring together these projects and then nice to reflect on them a little bit. I think, you know, I'm the product of a city. I've lived in the city all my life. And so the countryside is something quite strange and far away and exotic for me. And maybe it's tells me something about a time, another time, you know, when I look at buildings in the countryside. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I think maybe our interest in buildings in the countryside and rurality is just an extreme version of something that we're interested in, maybe in all our projects. And the raw and the cooked, I mean, it's mostly a poetic image about that fine between raw and cooked. What a lovely image for us as architects. But it's also about the codes and about, I guess, the lack of innocence in things, so that when we talk about the natural, when we talk about the countryside, we can end up or nature, we can end up talking about the natural in a quite lazy way. But I think, the raw and the cooked, those Saussure and those people showed us that actually there are very, very precise codes that are going on even in the preparation of food between raw and cooked. And then we're going to try and unpick a little bit of those later on. And it's interesting for us to do that, for me to do that, because in our practice, I guess we don't use, pre-theorize things, but we do think about things, obviously. But we use the word natural a lot. We use the word, to sort of mean that something's slightly unaffected. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. I mean, this is an image. I think it's from the Glyptotek in Copenhagen, but it's stone sculptures, and they've with this beautiful carving that makes them feel like veils. And I guess I like this image because it makes me think that maybe there's something slightly richer than in architecture we hear about the truth to materials. And this makes me think, aha, there's something much more fun than being boringly true to materials. There's being quite evident about the material and then transcending it, trans-sublimating it, a very sort of Nietzschean kind of approach, I guess. So the material is absolutely evident. There's no hiding of it, but there's a virtuosity about it, about a kind of delight and almost a kind of spirit. And so this sort of this dialogue between the material and the kind of spiritual, I don't mean in a religious sense, I just mean in the kind of the human kind of spirit, is seems to be at work in work like this, in this sculpture. And maybe that's an ambition for our work of architecture, which is obviously quite a high ambition to have. Again, I'm going to show you 4 projects tonight, and there's not going to be a lot of theory, but I am going to start with a little quote, because recently one of the projects I'm going to show you was in Casabella, and the front essay by Francesco del Co I thought was a really amazing essay, actually, and it was about this word called sprezzatura, and I don't know, and I'm going to quote you just a tiny bit of it, and it's the word was apparently coined by Baldassare Castiglione in his book, The Book of the Courtier, back in the 17th century, and the word means, and I'm just going to quote, to avoid any kind of affectation, as though it were a rough and dangerous reef, in order to practice in all things a certain sprezzatura, perhaps nonchalance, so as to conceal all art and make whatever one does or say seem effortless and almost unpremeditated. And then they go on to kind of situate that word and all its use and all its misuse, because it might sound like something rather nice to be natural and unaffected, but of course it gets used and abused, and the purpose for the word was to talk about political power, and we know that lots of politicians use it as a way of dissembling and pretending not to be learned. Anyway, I think I found it a really useful word for us, because these are the words we use in the studio. We wonder whether things are too affected or whether they feel natural, that they feel whether they kind of feel right. So the project I'm going to show you is perhaps an example of that, and it's Hillside Gardens in Bath, and this was the site when we sort of started, and it's a site for a pair of guys who are landscape gardeners, absolutely amazing gardener. In fact, it's Dan Pearson, who's very famous, but quite an amazing genius at gardens and plants. And I think I've been always slightly in awe of him, and certainly full of kind of admiration. And so, you know, and this was their house that they were buying, and it was slightly a bit of a ruin, and they were very interested in landscape, not necessarily immediately to make gardens, but I think the task seemed to be, they were moving out of the city, they were moving to this beautiful rural location, and I guess, you know, the task was to find some way of being quite simple and strong and enjoy kind of materiality. And it was slightly frightening at the beginning of the project, where they are both designers, they're both very literate about design, and they handed us a pile of about 50 copies of World of Interiors and Elle Decoration, and said, here are some things we like. And of course, for an architect, that's kind of useful, but it was kind of this huge, heavy weight of kind of stuff and references to look out for. Anyway, we managed to get over that, and I think, you know, come to some fairly more simple conclusions based on some quite shared kind of ideas with the client. So the project I'm going to show you, can you see my mouse? Is that working? So, okay, so the project I'm going to show you is this one on the left, which is the extension and renovation of a milking barn, but the project also involved the house above it and a potential extension to that house. But I'm just going to focus on this milking barn down here for now. And you can see the house above, and you can see the milking barn below. And really, the milking barn grows out of, in our reading of it, extension of it, we have a kind of we make a series of terraces of the landscape, because the landscape is quite steep and it's not so comfortable to stand on. So actually you want to make these terraces. And this wall that you can see at the bottom is one of those terraces, and it kind of defines the edge of the territory of the house and in the future of the garden vis-a-vis the fields. And so we like that this is a kind of strong stone, a strong boulder at the edge of the house, and the sheep will come and all the way up the fields and graze to it. And then the milking barn now sort of grows out of that territory, of that boundary wall, which is a condition that we kind of see in rural and farm buildings, of that sort of growing quite naturally out of a boundary fence. And you can see, I think, the original building and the replacement to the side as a lean-to, replacement of a previous lean-to, and the way that kind of bounds the territory. And here we see it in the plan and in relation to the house. And really, it's part of a linear sequence, really, of a few, now is becoming established as a garden to the south, the house, and then there's these little long terraces, gardens, and other barns along. So it kind of runs along the contour and kind of holds the edge of that territory. And here we can see that from that eastern side. You can see the kind of long views down the valley, and the way that this milking barn is sort of opened up to form a belvedere at the end. And you can see in our kind of mini homage to Gast, the idea that the new joins the old quite seamlessly, and without any shadow gaps or without any articulation. It just sort of glues onto the older building in a process that is familiar from rural buildings or historical buildings, where cathedrals just get a bit more added on, and they're not very rhetorical about what is new and old, even with a change of material. So an ambiguity, being ambiguous about the age of materials, I think is quite fun. And here you see it, so that ambiguity gives way to maybe a bit more of a declaration of a kind of contemporary intent with this oriel window, and then this kind of matching void to the right. And in here you can see the subtle kind of rustication of the base, where the base of the plinth of the landscape gives way to a different order of blockwork and different order of blockwork, and again onto the column, a kind of rustic order of column. And then from the inside, it's that window actually goes down to the floor, and because of the falling topography, one is then looking out directly into trees and across the valley. And I guess this is in relation to that sculpture of veils, in which we enjoy the straightforward honesty of materials in one way, the concrete blocks and the concrete lintels and the troll deck ceiling and the concrete floor, but it's not about those things. It's about creating an atmosphere and a certain luxury from those materials. And that luxury can involve other senses other than the visual. So the troll deck ceiling we like, and we use it in a lot of projects, and we like it a lot because it's quite ambiguous about its age. One could be looking at a kind of Scandinavian 60s building or something. It's quite ambiguous about its materiality. It's very raw and rough and natural, but processed. But also it absorbs sound, and acoustics for us is a very important part of a project. So the senses, all of the senses in a project, which is difficult to convey in these lectures, which are necessarily sort of visual. So you'll see troll deck appearing in our other work. We like it a lot, but it is about this kind of particular atmosphere that one can get, and the particular atmosphere that one can get from darkness. And we think here of a book, In Praise of Shadows by Tanizaki, who hopefully many of you will have read. And we enjoy that. And Dan Pearson, the client, it was one of his favorites too. And so we're able to, it's a nice thing to find, in common. And for example, Tanizaki talks about the pleasures of an outdoor toilet and of sitting there in the darkness in this toilet, but actually, I can't quite remember it, but kind of hearing the outsides and seeing the beetles walking about. And I think that's really powerful. And I'm interested in that lots of interiors seem to be about lightness and brightness, as if those were just virtues in themselves, but actually depth and darkness are also really beautiful, enveloping, comforting qualities. And maybe also particularly in beautiful landscape settings, because actually to have this dark aperture out to an amazing green verdant outside. So quite a lot of use of this dark wall lining of stained triboard timber, heavily stained. And here, rather than having a window, having a wooden shutter. And then, from darkness, you open up and get this amazing view. But I just find the way that light spills across dark surfaces to be very beautiful and very soft, I think. And it's very hard to photograph. Lewis Kahn, the photographer who took these, did an amazing job. But yes, it's quite hard to photograph a set of very dark interior spaces. But what the photographs do bring out, I think, nicely is the way that the color of the colors. It's not all just light and shade. Actually, you can see this sort of a brilliant patch of green coming in from the outside. And there we see how the kind of building is really holding that territory, and we're starting to see that belvedere. And here's the rustic order of column. I mean, this is not our invention. We've seen farmers do this before, but we just find it very charming. And then I guess there's a kind of something about some places where you want to be protected and maybe sit, and others where it's nice to have a more dramatic, open, unmediated opening to the landscape. And that's looking down a hill to that belvedere, which now is subsumed by this incredibly beautiful garden that Dan and Hugh are making. Oh, it's even more crazily wild and beautiful than this now. And that's just the model of that proposal. And here's some more darkness. And I guess that's it should probably be earlier in the slideshow, but it's here. But this is a painting that means a lot to us. It's St. Jerome in his study. And I guess one thing to say that the more famous painting for architects is St. Jerome in his study by Antonio del Messina, where he's sitting in a little study in the middle of a great big space, but it always looks a bit drafty and uncomfortable to me. So I really enjoy this one, and maybe you can see some of the relevance to Hillside, but it's probably more relevant to some of our other projects. But the tall ceilings, the way that the furniture lines the walls and lines the windows and makes this really comfortable corner at the edge of the room, the beautiful quality of light coming through, and the size of the kind of architectural elements where a fireplace becomes an enormous architectural element, the size of the room, and he's dressed, and then just, yeah. Okay, I'm now going to show you an older project called Brockholes Visitor Center. Now, this is a visitor center for a nature reserve, but the nature reserve was actually made in a series of gravel pits that were, so gravel had been extracted from all of these pits, and then it was finished, and then a nature reserve took it over. And here's the River Ribble running around it and into the city of Preston. Now, there are real nature reserves, really big nature reserves, further along the river out towards the estuary, with miles of open, beautiful, kind of marshy reeds. And so you'd think that would be a normal place for a visitor centre. And in a way, look, you can see the motorway, one of the main motorways of UK, the M6 coming here, and a huge, great junction. And then we're on to the edge of Preston as a city. And so, there's, why build a nature reserve here? And really the brief was about introducing people to nature. So encouraging city dwellers who may feel nervous or uncertain about how to visit nature. That may seem crazy to some of you who are more familiar with nature, but there are many people who live in cities who really just don't know how to get out to cities and to nature. And when they do, they find that there's someone in there with very expensive binoculars telling them to be quiet or something like that. So it's a kind of, the brief here was for an introductory nature reserve, and maybe somewhere that would have a patchwork of different habitats and allow people to feel comfortable, allow people to feel very easy to get there. And maybe people would just stop along the motorway, just stop for a cup of tea. And that's how they would get in. So all of these ways to draw people in who wouldn't normally come to a nature reserve. And so in that way, it's a kind of hyper modern condition where, this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not an innocent kind of view of nature. This is a human nature. This is a kind of recreated nature and biodiversity, and a project about reconnecting humans, with nature. And so, you know, there's the hyper-modernity of being on this nodal ring on this motorway, is, you know, is critical. And I guess, you know, the gravel pits will take a while to become established, but clearly they're going to be reedy, full of reeds, like the marshy wetlands. That was the main kind of habitat. And luckily, we'd been recently, at the same as when we did this project, the competition, we'd just been to the Pitt Rivers Museum and seen an exhibition of photographs of Thesiger, who was the ethnographer, anthropologist who visited the marsh Arabs, and, you know, just absolutely adored these settlements that are all built out of a single material, all built out of the reeds, built as floating islands, and then built as settlements, collectives, ensembles, but sort of dotted around the place, and then built with incredible virtuosity about whether to make roofs, whether to make big structural elements. And of course, this is a fairly romantic view of this place, because the place was actually one of great hardship. But I think anyway, architecturally, there's a great deal of fertility in here. So I guess if you bear in mind that romantic view of the reeds, and then you think, and the wetlands, and then you think of this turning off of the motorway and arriving, and this trying to excite people, and particularly children, about how to visit a nature reserve, then that first glimpse seems very important. And so this is this kind of early sketch of turning off of the motorway and arriving and seeing this little village that makes you want to explore the place. And also, therefore, contains the people in one place, and gets you down to the water's edge, which is the kind of lovely place to be. So that's an image of the built project as this kind of collection, this settlement. And then it's more sort of iconic view across the lake. I mean, we imagined that actually the reeds would grow around it, and the reeds would grow up to the level of the eaves, and this would be therefore more like the previous image and become roofs emerging out of reeds. And the Wildlife Trust did start to grow reeds around it, and you can see them to the left. But they loved the building so much they didn't want to cover it with reeds, which was I thought was a bit of a shame, actually. But anyway, it's not my choice. So the buildings, the cluster, is on this kind of carpet, on this kind of floating carpet, and we like these carpets. So this is a Persian carpet, and it's actually a depiction of a walled garden, of a depiction of paradise, for example. And I guess we like these cluster of buildings. We like them. This is the reflected ceiling plan. And I guess what you can see from this is this kind of set of buildings that are like kind of structural nets. And you can see that the spaces between the buildings are as important. So the buildings are framing a set of spaces, each with a different character. So from the arrival on the right, there's a kind of arrival square with these long, thin glimpses out to the water and this view on. And then the second space is bound on, so the first one is bound on 4 sides. The second one is bound on 3 sides, where the reeds and the water will be the 4th side of that square. And then there's a longer square. Then one comes into a longer square that is looking to the long view down the lake, but has its own little orchard. So having left the kind of wilder nature behind, one now arrives in a very formalized nature. And I think maybe one thing to add is that these are fairly simple barns, most of them, but the building at the bottom left here is a conference center, and that is the that's like a mini version. It's a kind of fractal version of the whole island. So it's the same proportions as the whole island. And it itself is a collection of barn roofs, a set of connected rooms. So that's as we step on to the island, not an island, sorry, onto the raft. It's a floating raft, and this is an articulating bridge with the oak shakes and the oak cladding. And as I mentioned, the whole building floats, and then that can give it unlimited flood protection because the big river next door floods, but it can also get you down to be very close to the reeds where the birds and the animals flit in and out. So it's a good place to be down at the water's edge. This is the raft under construction. So it's a big concrete a box full of foam. In this case, they drained the lake so that they could cast the raft on the lake bed, and then water was let in and the raft floated, and it's now floating and floated even higher in a flood a couple of years ago. So we actually know that it does work. It does work and protect it from flooding. And you can just see the kind of tree pits for the orchard on this end of the raft, and you can start to see the barn going up here with the kind of prefabricated glulam timbers. And it doesn't have much water underneath it. It doesn't need much water, but it does, nevertheless, it does actually float. And I think this section was always important to us, not just in terms of, you can see the depth of the raft, but in terms of this moving from big, tall barn spaces to a kind of compression where you come through to a set of kind of smaller undulating roof, which is then filled in a kind of layered way. These are a picture of the reeds surrounding it, and I think it's we sometimes use the phrase building with air, because these Cordec polystyrene blocks fill the pontoon, and they are 98% air, and that's what keeps the pontoon afloat. But actually, I think it's interesting that in modern building, one is often building with air. You know, we build these huge insulated walls, and that's looking from the pontoon across the water and across the walkways that lead to the bridge. And then there are these kind of articulated bridges, and then these drawbridges to kind of shut the center. And this is one of the most typical reflected ceiling plans. And I guess what's the note here is that we like the way that the structure continues around, or just continues around, and it feels like a kind of net that is being expanded. And yeah, you see that, and then how the unevenness of the roof, which is letting in top light, leads to a distortion of the roof members, and we kind of like the way they skip along and change their angle slightly, but also absolutely continue around. And here you can see some acoustic kind of felt. Actually, it's made of recycled paper and coloured and blown into all the roof surfaces, and again giving a really huge amount of acoustic absorption. So that feeling of walking into a hay barn, or when it has just snowed and everything is hushed and quiet. So we enjoy that. And I think you can see here also something about the layering of the envelope, from the structure to the doors to the wall linings, something that we quite enjoy. It's just a detail section of that. And then there's the frames going up. And then that's in that conference center building where the one where it's a collection of smaller rooms gets lined with a finer lining instead of expressing the roof structure at that point. with the complexity of these roofs here, and with the small scale, I mentioned the kind of fractal moving down in scale to introduce a kind of a wall lining of oak that feels a bit more like silk or something like that. And then occasionally to lob in the occasional surprise of a kind of mirrored ceiling. I think one of the works I'd seen that really affected me previously was this work by Gerhard Richter, 8 Greys. And it's very simple. It's just grey glass across both sides of a gallery, and one sees reflections of reflections, and one sees people reflected in this kind of watery way. And I guess in our very small way, we liked this to do this. And so using this frameless glazing underneath all this raw and rough oak and these shakes, and to have these moments of very watery reflection, and to try and get moments where there would be sort of doubled and triple reflections. And that's inside as well. So this is looking outside to a glass partition, so to the next room, but there's a kind of nice complexity and ambiguity about what is image and what is reflection and what is shadow. And then the blinds making these spaces outside, this sort of deepened threshold outside the window. And then that's looking kind of through these buildings, through to the water on the outside, seeing the reeds outside, the resonance with us inside. And I guess then there's this kind of sense of melancholy, which we enjoy in cities and buildings, and we find is perhaps not so highly appreciated these days. Certainly not in the design process, I think, by most people out in a city. They understand this, but I think designers are often not, it's not top of their list to achieve a sense of melancholy, but I find it very important. And lastly here, it's the building being used properly. So I find it interesting that this building has become used as a very popular event for weddings. And I think that's a lovely thing. And I think it's testament to being a proper public building. And, you know, it's one of our tests for our buildings when we make buildings is when we make a community hall or a school hall. Our test for ourselves is, would you hold your wedding there? Because when we think of the beautiful rooms, one does usually have weddings, or usually older buildings. It's a good test, isn't it? And the modern kind of multifunctional spaces often don't really match that test. And I think this is one way to achieve incredible kind of flexibility and sustainability. If you make a building that's happy enough for you to have your wedding there, then it will find many uses over its time. So that's a kind of concept of aesthetic sustainability. You make it beautiful enough and people will want to use it again and again. And that's a slab of tea. The next project is Seizure Gallery. And I'm going to go through these slides quite quickly, but this was an amazing work of art by Roger Heons, and it was in a redundant social housing flat in London. The block of housing was going to be pulled down, and Roger was allowed to use the place, and he filled the place with sort of boiling hot copper sulfate solution and let crystals grow on the wall, and then emptied it, and then allowed people to walk into this flat, and it was a quite amazing experience, and it became a huge popular, and they had to reopen it again because it's so popular, and a huge internet sensation in the kind of early days of the internet. And these really spiky blue delicious crystals. But actually it wasn't just the flat that they'd lined. There was more contrivance to it than that, because if they'd just filled the flat with all this hot liquid, it would have burst. So they had actually got an engineer to build a big steel cage inside the flat, and then lined that with plywood, and then lined that with mesh for the crystals to grow on. And it was supposed to be a temporary artwork, site-specific work, but actually it was so incredibly, everyone loved it so much that when it came for the buildings to be pulled down, there was a kind of huge effort to rescue the work of art and to say that it should not be lost. And so this, luckily, this huge steel cage was nice and strong. So they were able to just drag it out. It wasn't designed for this at all, but they were able to just pull it out and then take it up to Yorkshire Sculpture Park, all 30 tons of it. And here's the woman responsible really for rescuing it, Caroline Douglas, where it was, left in the car park. Yorkshire Sculpture Park is a sort of amazing park, very idyllic English landscape, romantic English landscape with Henry Moors and things like that. And had been this sort of aristocratic, country park. And then we won the competition to build a gallery for it. The gallery, the idea was that it would be temporary. They only offered to look after it for 10 years, and the building had to be temporary and be taken apart after that. And there was a question about where to put this building, and so this is the kind of romantic landscape, and you can see here a beautiful walled garden with a thick kind of building as a wall, and then here you can see the service yard that most visitors to the sculpture park don't see. And I guess we like this location on the threshold between the proper park, between the romantic English landscape and the service yard. And I think the artist, Roger, really enjoyed this idea that his work would be stored in a kind of container in sort of temporary storage in the service yard. I think that really tickled him a lot. So here you can see, where it's kind of sited. We can see the gallery there on that threshold. The walled garden next to it is a beautiful 18th century walled garden with trees growing up it, but it also has thickness. And I guess we like that idea that it's a wall, but it actually also has thickness as a room, and that it has an ambiguity about it. So it uses this very familiar language of fencing, of this concrete post and panel fencing. In fact, it's so familiar that this is a sort of thing you see from the train or in the outskirts of cities, and we like it because it has an innocence. It has a kind of absolute background quality to it that has this. So if we come back to that word sprezzatura again, it's this clearly quite a knowing statement of a lack of effect or an innocence. But and we like the kind of mystery of it feeling a little bit like a fairy tale, a garden wall with a single door in it, and not very much announcement of what's going on, not much depiction of what you're going to see. And so just it's part of this kind of language of big hedges and walls. And this big steel door. And when you come in, you see the artwork. We were quite clear that we didn't want to cover this up. This was part of its history, this steel box. I think the gallery, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, initially assumed that they would cover this up and one would be drawn to the entrance to the work of art along a sort of curated corridor. But I thought it was nice, very important to see to disclose the artifice, like in a Brecht kind of play, and also to disclose the kind of history of the work, which after all was being entirely reinvented by being brought to this situation of a sculpture park. And I think both we and Roger, the artist, really enjoyed that process and I think it was quite a nervous time for Roger, but I think there were so many potentials to reinventing the work and giving it a quite different set of resonances and meanings in this romantic English landscape. So one comes in at the top here, and then there's a sort of choreography about how to enter this art work, which is you enter the artwork at the bottom right of this. So one has to acclimatize to the darkness, otherwise not going to enjoy the work. One has to sit down and put little plastic shoes on, and then so there's a sort of little choreography in that. We were very clear we liked the work to be off-center. We didn't want it to be in the center like Lenin's tomb. So there was a kind of careful. And then this is the section. The work is very heavy and it's craned in from the top. So there has to be a lid, a big steel lid to the gallery, which allows you to drop the work in. And this is looking at people sitting on this bench, a heated electrical bench, putting on their shoes on, ready in anticipation to enter the work of art. That's a little bit more detail. Sorry, same drawing again, similar. And this is from the original competition. And this is the idea that actually, you know, the light is spilling out, and this is part of the anticipation and build up to going into the work. And that's how it is. You'll see that there are gaps between the concrete panels, and these are do a number of jobs. One is that the climate has to be regulated to keep the crystals. It needs to be nice and humid and cool and humid, and so you need a thorough ventilation through it at all times. I think it also creates this very low level light, so we can acclimatize your eyes to the darkness, but it also lets sound in. Sound again, that kind of sense of, so one's come in from the park, the romantic park, one's come through a fence, but actually once you're in here, suddenly you hear all the sounds of the service yard, and so that is disclosed to you. And here's where we walk into the work of art. And this is the view that visitors won't see. This is the view from the service yard, but we like this very much. And you can again, more service yard kind of views. You can see the steel lid, and you can see it taking its place as just another kind of storage box in the service yard. That's looking into the crystals. And here you can see the stainless steel shims, which keep the wall panels apart. And perhaps you can also see some of the texture of the concrete. This is a more dramatic shot inside of those shims and the strange shadows that they make. And then coming out of the work of art, then one comes out, and maybe one didn't realize before, but actually it turns out that then you are on this long axis down to a piece of statuary at the end of this kind of long axis. So one is reintroduced back into this romantic, idyllic landscape park. And I think when one thinks of the kind of origins of the work in a failed utopian housing project, and when one thinks of this new situation in this idyllic, romantic landscape garden that nevertheless, you know, when they were built in the 18th century were used as kind of political metaphors, you can see the kind of richness of the kind of overtones that are being brought to the work. It is a prefabricated concrete structure, so it all bolts together and can at some point bolt apart, I guess. But like many temporary structures, I guess this one was probably going to end up staying there for a long time because it has been quite popular. And just a small detail, I guess, when we made these concrete panels, there's a bad side to a piece of concrete casting, the air side, and we put this on the outside. So the smooth, proper side is on the inside, which is fine because it's that kind of interior. And then we enjoyed this rough surface on the outside, and we like these kind of cloudy, misty qualities of it, a bit like a Japanese wallpaper. Okay, I'm going to just show you one more project very briefly. This is a project situated at Pensthorpe Wildlife and Gardens, and this isn't the project. So Pensthorpe is another visitor centre, this time kind of privately run. And this is one of the barns on the centre. And I guess this is, we find this very enjoyable. So, you know, when I talked earlier about our fascination with rural farm buildings, what we see there is a really beautiful directness to the buildings and an expediency in the buildings. I mean, look at the way this gutter has been formed by just pulling out the bottom of the cladding like a skirt, and we find that very, very beautiful. And there's an elegance about its proportion and its height. So there are so many kind of material, formal, constructional qualities that we find in farm and rural buildings that are, you know, just kind of very inspiring. And I think that's perhaps because the buildings that we normally make have become so layered and so complex because of the performance targets that we're all meeting, but we are, you know, it's harder to recover that sense of immediacy and directness, and also just ridiculous slenderness. I mean, look at these beautiful slender columns. It looks like it's by some amazing. You'd have to get a virtuosic Swiss or Japanese engineer to allow you to do this these days, eh? So Pensthorpe is where people go to look at ducks and birds. And this is them looking at it. And our work involved master planning the whole of the kind of settlement, including the boring bits of the car park and the lorry and the coach park arrival. And we're not going to really present that tonight. And there's the river here and wetlands, and then this what had been previously a long time ago a little village. But anyway, so our master planning really started from the point of view of it as a village, and there's a kind of cluster. And you know, we are very drawn to these photos of this is from The Anatomy of the Village by Dennis Sharp, a very beautiful book, where we see all the kind of really beautiful kind of landscape architectural qualities that have largely been lost in current cities. You know, you can imagine what this looks like now. It's probably a big road coming through and pavements and whatever, but this directness of things, of surfaces coming up to meet the buildings, of expanses between buildings, of big territories between buildings, and river running through, absolutely beautiful. So the barn I'm going to show you is the one at the back. It's called the play barn, but our work also involved the renovation of other buildings and sometimes an extension to those buildings, and in a sort of phased series. So this is looking at that section. So the building we were just looking at is on the left there, and then the new barn is on the right. And it is a fairly simple single kind of barn structure. And the idea is it would be very flexible. And the idea was that it would house soft play. You know, those kind of horrible environments that are full of plastic and urine, where, you know, you take children and they climb about on the kind of plastic covered scaffolding. So that was a very popular thing to have here. It rains a lot and parents wanted somewhere to go to, so the client was very keen to have one of those. But the brief was that it would be, the barn would be flexible, so it could have other uses, you know, at other times. And we enjoyed the kind of, I guess, the prospect of making a contemporary barn that was comfortable, that was very sustainable, so it used energy very well, but was a comfortable environment and is super flexible. And so you can see here the kind of the tree structure of the steels, the bracing. You can see this kind of very open at the ground level out to landscape, but then more punctuated at a higher level. And you know, the plan evolved quite a lot to eventually include a cafe and the entrance sequence, but really all of these additions are additional layers that can be taken out. And this is the reflected ceiling plan. And again, sort of dealing with things like balancing, you know, the direction of light coming in. So east light, sunlight is useful for warming the place up in the morning. West light is lovely because it's like, gives a warmth and a sunshine, but it's not so good for overheating. So balancing those. So I guess moving on from the kind of traditional sawtooth roof where it was facing north to get this kind of lighting for industrial purposes, and actually using that now in a way that acknowledges kind of the human comfort, but also the kind of you know, sensible energy kind of strategy use. The roof was constructed of these long ladder beams that were brought to site prefabricated. This is the upper floor. We sketched out a kind of inhabitation of this, a set of kind of play structures, educational kind of play structures about nature and farming, stuff like that. In the end, we didn't get the job to do this interior. Someone else did. And so the interior is not really by ours. And unfortunately, we never got a moment where the building was built without stuff in it. So we never got the epic shot of the empty barn, because the thing was built in such a hurry and desperate to finish it that they were actually building both at the same time. Anyway, I think you can get a sense of the kind of these kind of tree structures of the steel. We liked the steel structures. What we liked, and if you think about the barn we just showed you earlier on, was you know, steel I-beams and L angle beams that have a finesse, you know, they have a fineness about their edge. Whereas a lot of contemporary steel buildings, if you look at, you know, industrial sheds, they're made of hollow section, which is fine, it's quite efficient, but it's not very kind of fine or kind of elegant finding. So we made quite a big effort with this amazing engineer structure workshop to use all these kind of flange sections. And then you can see more troll deck, this material that we love so much, kind of doing lots of acoustic absorption and getting this thing that feels a little bit like thatch or reeds. And then you can see this approach to linings. Again, maybe this is the San Jerome and the Steenwijk image you can think of, that kind of, and the kind of layering. So windows don't really respect the position of structure. You know, structure comes first and structure will endure. The windows, the linings might change, windows change, so structure endures. So there's an offset. And then again, the lining just sort of runs across the structure. And you can see other examples of that. So we enjoy these sort of structural moments popping up in sort of odd places. And I guess this is a junction, is showing that kind of fineness of those steel sections. Yeah, just going to balance the light. And then this is one of those long ladder kind of trusses that comes across. And that's the view from the outside. We're sort of amongst the trees. And then doing things like, you know, pulling the rainwater pipes away from the buildings and landing them in troughs so that the kind of natural processes of rainwater become more evident and are enjoyed as a kind of embellishment of the building. I like the way that the interior, people who did the interior building have felt necessary to put pictures of leaves on the glass. And I don't know if this was a homage to our steel tree structure or not, but it kind of works quite nicely. And then, you know, very simple devices of taking timber cladding and just cutting little holes in it, and, you know, gives potential for you know, nesting, and that's in the future, but also a kind of an ornament that we were, you know, we obviously been looking at bird plumage. I think we started the project with a more exotic version with colored tiles in a kind of peacock plumage, and this is a much reduced kind of version, and enjoying the kind of just I guess the kind of edging of these timber profile, a bit like old train sheds. Okay, that's the end. Thank you. I think you've got some questions.
But first of all, Adam, thank you very much for taking us on this walk through the landscape and a selection of your buildings. And I think it's fantastic how different they all are. And that way they all sharpen a particular consciousness of landscape, which is either romantic or it can also have a certain harshness to it, like the Seizure Gallery, which has new aspects of how landscape is perceived. We have now the opportunity to ask questions. We have a little delay on our YouTube channel of 10 seconds, so I'll try to bridge that, but please do type in your questions and we'll read them out to start a little conversation with Adam. I like how all these buildings are deeply developed out of their context, and they all have their own material set. And it's great to listen to you how these spaces are made, but also how they affect us and how we use those spaces. They're all in the landscape. How do you see an idea of eco design, which often has a short-sighted connotation, and I feel in your buildings it has a more complex and multifaceted meaning. Like Luigi Snozzi once said, the Pantheon in a way is the most ecological building. It has been there forever. It hasn't produced any waste. It always adjusts itself to the thermal climate, and can be used in many different ways. And I think it's nice to see that BREEAM or eco design doesn't necessarily have to be timber. I think there were many ways how to tackle it. How do you make that work in an integrated approach?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, our starting point is, like you mentioned, the Luigi Snozzi, and that's the concept I mentioned of a sort of aesthetic sustainability, that actually if something's valued, it will sustain. So the first thing is to make something beautiful and very useful, and then people will want to use it and keep it there. And that's you know, one of the main all the energy and expense and carbon that goes into making a building. That's what you don't want to throw away. You know, we don't want to be redoing that. I mean, I sort of cringe when I hear eco-design, and one worries. On the other hand, you know, we do have a massive responsibility, and I think the role of architects is always to do both, and, you know, to take very seriously the kind of technical performance, whether it's fire, making sure people don't die in a building, or the building doesn't contribute to global warming. I think those are very strong, heavy responsibilities that we have to do, and we can't turn them into rhetorical either ors. We can't turn them into either eco or beauty, or, you know. And so, you know, there are architects who I think don't want to go near their responsibilities about sustainability, but I think it's deeper than the kind of I think what probably alarms us about a lot of talk about eco design is the superficial aspect of it, or the concentration on either one aspect of it, just the immediate energy performance, or on very kind of untested ideas of what natural is. So yeah, I think it is a huge responsibility, but I think things have changed. You know, I think when we designed Brockholes, there was this kind of, you know, there were architects who were interested in architecture and high architecture, and there were architects who were interested in sustainability, and the two didn't really meet. we're antagonistic, if anything, to each other. And I think that's changed in a more mature kind of sense has developed. But you know, it's the kind of, again, the simple tests of would you value a building? Are people going to value it? And so if it's beautiful and useful, people will value it and maintain it and look after it. That's the strongest sense of sustainability. And there's also a much deeper sustainability about the kind of whole concept of landscape anyway, I think. I mean, I've been working recently in Devon and close to landscapes that are just full of fields of cattle, and one wonders how long that will be, because it's a completely unsustainable process of food growing. Anyway, much more, and on wilding as well. So there's much more. There's, you know, the debates have really moved on, and I think it's an interesting point right now.
With sustainability, you also talked about aesthetic sustainability, and you also use words like elegance, embellishment, and refinement. And I think since I've known you, you're one of the few people who aren't afraid of talking about beauty, because it's a little bit of a taboo, and often it comes as a side product that we are not articulating consciously, and it's slippery ground, and of course it's very multifaceted. I think one can sense now, having seen some of your projects, but maybe looking also at other projects on your website, like Finkenau, the housing facade. Maybe you can explain what dimension that idea of beauty has for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of, to me, it's self-evident, and the sort of number one list on our jobs of things to do. I mean, well, there's the one thing, if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? But I mean, really, it's the first thing that we're there to do, and I think this is maybe a product of over theorizing, because actually, you know, if you get out there in the world and outside of the architectural bubble, it's just obvious to people that beauty is a thing that people appreciate, when even on their holiday photos of buildings, on their visits, on what they like and what they talk about. It's just obvious, but it becomes hugely problematic only in terms of a kind of theoretical discourse bubble, you know, where it's just incredibly problematized. And yes, I mean, beauty has been used, you know, as the preserve of a kind of ruling elite, and it has all those things, has all that history to it. But so does everything else have a lot of bad history to it as well. So it's, you know, yeah, fairly straightforwardly, really. And I think most people actually enjoy it, and maybe they don't use the word, but I really don't see why people don't just come out and say it. And I think more people are. I think when we set up and put that on our kind of statement on our website, you're right, it was a bit rare, but I think it's fortunately it's become more obvious. Maybe, and who knows, maybe things like Instagram have helped. Maybe it's just obvious that people enjoy and love beauty, and the architects were the weirdos by distancing themselves from that.
Yeah, that's a really direct and good statement. And maybe the next question here from the audience is a bit related to that. And it's about how you navigate maybe between the raw and the cooked, or as Jonas is phrasing it here, the directness you experience and admire in rural farm buildings on the one side, and on the other side, the poetic approach of richness in your schemes. How do you find the balance between that? How does that evolve?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. it's really good. And I think one fortune for us perhaps has been poverty. We've often been dealing with quite humble budgets and situations where one is just having to be very inventive about how one uses ordinary materials. And maybe if we'd had the opportunity of working on much higher budgets, we wouldn't have been able to work at that so hard. Because I think, and it's a good question, because as I say, nothing is innocent, and it's not about this kind of rawness is good and refine and and it's the best thing you can do. It's all set within a context. It's all a story, really. It's all a human kind of story about that. And so I think, as I mentioned on kind of Hillside, it is about a certain kind of a particular type of luxury. A luxury is not about having things. It's a luxury of experience, of experiencing things in themselves. I'm thinking of Irene Scalbert's lovely book about a real living contact with the things in themselves. That's that lovely book. And, maybe that's a kind of very contemporary, strong luxury in a world where we're saturated with visual images. We're saturated with actual material comfort, but maybe what we don't have so much is a kind of, a direct contact with senses, with acoustics, with touch, with atmosphere. And so those raw materials are really, really prompts for that. They're not good things in themselves. There's nothing virtuous about a concrete block more than any other material. But if they have, and there's often also a certain sense of innocence. So if something is proclaiming its design credentials as being new, as being flashy, as being amazing, actually it can dazzle you eyes, and it can take you away from that kind of being centered and being in a place. It can actually become the foreground. Whereas I guess what we're interested in is the architecture actually being the background. And that's the same for our work in the cities, where we see the architecture as the background to life, to the city life, to civic life, to planting. And I think in these rural examples also, the building is actually a background to the experience of being in a place. So recognizing one's sense of being in a place, if that doesn't sound too grand, but I think it's that quality of choreography and orchestration. So one is using materials always in the service of something. For example, at Seizure Gallery, always in the service of the experience of the art. So for us, the only task of the building was to allow people to experience that artwork in a strong way. But the responsibility was also to realize that we were reinventing that artwork by putting it in that context. So yeah, it's a kind of humility, if you like, about centering our work, about privileging the experience of being in a place and allowing one to contact that place very directly, or contact other people. Maybe that's a theory. Maybe that's it.
Good. There are more and more questions popping up now. Maybe this could be connected to what you said. There's a question if there is a fascination about roofs, and what meaning or power does a roof have in your architecture, and how do you develop on these different approaches of roofs?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, we like roofs. I would say that it was the modernists who have the fetish about flat roofs, and I think we don't have any fetishes. So I think we're more open. We're the ones that are open-minded. We don't have a particular value system that says pitched roofs are good and flat roofs are bad. I think it's, you know, the modernists who had that kind of arbitrary value system. But really, I think it's got a deeper level. So I think of Gaston Bachelard, I think of The Poetics of Space, that lovely book where he talks about the different levels of a house and the kind of experiential qualities of and potentials of those different levels of the house. What's it like being in a basement compared to what's it like being under a roof in an attic? And we all know those the differences in those kind of feelings, and we remember them as children perhaps more, but they're all very strong, powerful effects on us. So I think that we approach that task with an open mind, but with an kind of awareness about the different charges that different spaces have. So what it's like to be in a roof, what it's like to have a roof come down so far that you can actually touch it from the ground. You know, Christopher Alexander mentions that very frequently. You know, Christopher Alexander of the pattern language. So, you know, it's those potentials really of roofs, and it's not a value judgment or a kind of statement of taste even, really. It's about and it's often about very practical issues like discharging water from a building and enjoying that process and seeing it. So we find lots of rich potential in pitched roofs, and I guess that's where when we started, that also felt a little bit not so frequently done. I think it's caught on. I'm not so interested in it as an image, you know. So I think there's a lot of kind of use of pitched roofs as an icon or as an image of home or of homeliness in social housing, for example. I'm not really interested in that. But a kind of certain familiarity, recognition, maybe a certain sort of unconscious, I mean, we haven't really mentioned it, but I think there's an important element of the unconscious collective of myth, of whether that's because of their kind of childlike images of, you know, images of kind of archetypes. I think they're very strong in architecture, and I think architecture does work at that subliminal unconscious level.
Those roofs, they come along in many different ways in your work, and sometimes they're steep and sometimes flat, sometimes gable, but they often have a strong face. And I've also seen on your Instagram account that you're disguising the roof. It's not always visible. For Laure Prouvost's project, it is hidden behind a large cloud. There's a subtle element of light humor and subversiveness, which is often producing a certain complexity. Or you also talked about ambiguity in your work, that it has an importance. For example, construction sitting right in front of a window, like in the play barn. We have seen how maybe there's often a fine calibration of rigor and a discipline and a pragmatic approach to how space is organized, but then there's a looseness and an element of play, how maybe not all of it, but some parts of it are articulated architecturally in a different way, and how they escape from a rigorous structure.
Yeah, I mean, I find there is a rigor. We enjoy that rigor, and if anything, it's a clearer rigor than I think a lot of times architects try to subsume things, or they try to cover up things, or they try to line things up, or they try to neaten things up. So that actually they go to more effort than we go to actually avoid, you know, a column coming in front of a window, whereas. And so it's almost unthinkable that you would want to put a column in front of a window, but actually it's a very enjoyable kind of thing. I mean, it's and it's part of slightly didactic about that kind of reading the layering of construction of a building. So the evident, what's a building made of, which is often hidden. It's nice to peel those away and actually reveal them and enjoy them. And then once one's exposed it, actually attend to its qualities. So this column, okay, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be just a square section hollow, or is it going to be actually a nice flange with very fine, an I-beam? So it's a process of revealing, displaying, and enjoying those, and enjoying the kind of the layering of space, out of the deepening of that threshold into a richer experience than simply inside and outside. So I think there's several reasons why we do that, and we're very indebted to people like the Japanese architect Sakamoto, who did that very, very beautifully. And I think the importance that you mentioned of a kind of the facades of buildings, that's that's clearly evident in the buildings we've seen, but I think that's even more important in the urban realm, where the buildings have a huge responsibility, not just to their owners of the buildings and the person inside, but to the street, to the decorum of the city, which I think is neglected, really, that sense of decorum. So the facade, facades, a dirty word in some architectural circumstances. I mean, I told you that we once talked to an architect who was moaning because he said all they get to design is a facade, and some other architect is doing the inside of the building in a kind of, and I said, well, that's great. That means you've got all your time to concentrate on the facade of the building. It's wonderful. And, he looked at me in horror. But, so that attention to facades is incredibly important, I think, and their depth, their sociability. Anyway, that's a topic of another talk. Yes.
Another question from the audience saying that it's great to see how your projects are so plural and diverse, and that's true. It doesn't look like you're developing a particular Adam Kahn handwriting with a set of materials and it's easily recognizable. How do you develop the projects to become so different, and how does that work in the office is the question, with a team, and how are they influenced within the design process to find their own expression, language and attitude?
That's a good question, because we don't, yes, you're right, we're not trying to develop an office style, but neither are we doing the opposite and trying to make everything different. If we could find, I think it's just simply taking each project as a fresh start, and actually the complexity of projects, given their different sites and their different clients and their different briefs, they're so unlike each other, the projects that one receives, and then one starts to dig into the potential of a project, and that adds huge more layers of complexity. So they soon become, if you approach them with an open mind, they soon become very, very different. And then, there's all sorts of other constraints and interesting relationships of context. And then there's kind of, I guess, shown in the talk, some particular strongly experiential kind of pieces of art, whether they're paintings or sculptures, that kind of influence one, and one can try and grab some of that, like the Gerhard Richter. One can be immediately enthused or momentarily enthused by a particular aspect and kind of push that along. I think there are commonalities, and I think that if you we've been working on patterned brickwork facades for years and have done many of them. Many of them haven't succeeded. Either they've been chopped away because of the budget, or the project didn't happen. But finally we've got one on site, and it's going to be a really beautiful, rich patterned brickwork. So there are obsessions that run over the course of 14 years of trying to do something. And if we'd been more successful and we'd done it, maybe we'd have moved on to something else, but we haven't. We're just still obsessed by patterned brickwork. And you mentioned finkenau, and we've got another one coming along with rich pattern. So there are sort of several lines of interest and obsession that run through the work, and we've never kind of gone about that process of cataloging them or defining them. I think the idea was to follow Mies van der Rohe's dictum of build first, talk later. So at some point we are going to get around to kind of talking about this and putting it down, but I think the idea was to build first, do a good body of buildings, responding to condition, responding quite intuitively to those conditions and opportunities, and then start to see where the commonalities lie afterwards. And I think we're just at that point now where we're trying to see those commonalities. And I think what is different is now that we're building a larger scale of social housing, there's a greater repetition in there.
Well, I guess we are very curious to see the next obsessions and new projects, and also new moments of sprezzatura. I think that was a very nice start, and maybe also a nice way to end the lecture. We want to see more of that. So in that way, thank you very much, Adam, for coming to us.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
And in 2 weeks, we have another lecture by Maya Unger, the practice from Leipzig, with new and fresh work. So you should definitely come in again and join us at the faculty Wednesday in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for everyone listening, and welcome back, hopefully soon.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.